Hi, this is Dan Heisman. We're here with another video on YouTube to help you improve your chess game. One of the common complaints I hear from amateur players is, oh, I was playing the game and afterwards I gave it to the engine and I knew I was winning and the engine said I was +5 and then I just threw it all away. You know, I did this, I did that, whatever they did, and they threw it all away. Well, I don't think we've looked at too many games like that, so I found one that one of my students played recently, and it's a really good example of that. We did have one earlier. It says how not to play when you're way ahead. This is a little different. When you're way ahead, you know, where you're like up a piece and then you should be trading and you should be keeping it simple and stuff like that. This game's a little different. Here, the person who was winning because they had a winning attack, and they never actually got up a lot of material. They just had easy lines where they could have been up a lot of material, and they ended up losing. So this is a little different than when you're already up a lot of material. We had a couple videos on that earlier. If you haven't seen them, one's called How Not to Play When Way Ahead, and another one's called When You're Way Ahead, It's a Different Game. So you can look for those videos. All right, let's take a look at this game. My student was white. My student was black. We could actually look at it from his side. We haven't done too many videos from the black side, so just for the fun of it, let's flip the board and we'll look at it from his side. He plays knight f6, looking for something like a Nimzo Indian, and white plays knight c3. Knight c3 usually leads to the Virasov opening. Now, what white's actually threatening here is to play e4, so that if black plays any move basically but d5, then after e4, white, for instance, if black plays d6, then after e4 we have a Pirtz defense. Or after g6 we have e4, again d6 Pirtz defense. Black could go into a French kind of opening. He could play e6, e4, d5 and go into the classical French. So if you're a French player, you can certainly do that against this. So black played the most principled move, which is to play d5. All right, so black plays d5, and now the main line is to play bishop to g5. White plays bishop f4, and now white's not really threatening knight to b5 because black can always play knight to a6. But black had looked up this opening ahead of time. He knew that white liked to play this line. It was like a team game where you know who you're playing. So he decided to play the a6 variation. So it wasn't like he was so afraid of knight b5 and he didn't realize he could defend against it. He actually chose to play this defense. All right, so white plays e3. Again, kind of typical, almost London kind of stuff now. London with knight on c3 instead of pawn on c3. e6, bishop d3, c5. There's the critical break move. And now that white doesn't have the pawn on c3, it's a little bit better. Knight f3, and now typical would be bishop d6 or knight c6. I think the engine here actually likes the anti-positional move c4. Why? Because without the pawn on c4 and white not able to play e4, that's usually the problem with c4 here, is white will break block the bishop back to c2 and then break with e4, and white will have all the play on the center and king side, and black will have not much play on the queen side. But here with a knight on c3, it's a lot different. Now c4, which normally is a pretty anti-positional, not so good move, is actually okay here. So black plays bishop d6 first. Bishop goes back to g3, and now he does play c4. So normally, as I said, you wouldn't do a move like that. It takes too much pressure off the center. But here, with only one pawn guarding here, even though black's not necessarily going for the e5 break, white can't easily play e4 in the next couple moves, and that's going to give black time enough to play moves like b5, b4, and get some space on the queen side. All right, so bishop e2, castle first, knight e5. This is where a couple games ago we saw a game where black played something like queen b6 and then knight c6, unguarding the bishop and allowing discovered attacks with the knight. Here that doesn't happen. Black plays queen c7. That's a move you wouldn't play if white could play knight b5 and win the bishop pair. But without knight to b5, then queen c7 perfectly okay. h4, aggressive move. Okay, looking at Alpha Zero playing h5, h6 against the king. Here, it's not really called for, but it's not terrible. It is aggressive. Black should continue normally here with moves like b5, b4, knight c6, bishop b7, maybe knight e4 after b4. He plays knight bd7, which is okay. I think knight c6 is more to the point, b5 is more to the point. f4, sort of playing it like Chigorin. It's not Chigorin, Pillsbury. Pillsbury liked to play knight e5 and then f4, but I don't think Pillsbury usually had his bishop on g3. And again, here, if black can get that knight out of there and stick this knight here and attack the unguarded bishop, this is all going to be pretty good for black. So black has no big problems here. Black's probably already slightly better. And black plays the logical b5. If you're going to play c4, you pretty much are forced to go for something like this. And now if white plays a3 to stop b4, black could just play rook to b8 and then a5 and b4 anyway. He can't play a5 right away because if knight takes b5. But after rook b8, he could play a5. So a3 will slow down black's attack, but it won't stop it. So white plays h5. Anytime your opponent does something like that, you have to figure, is h6 a threat? Because if I play g6, is my dark square is going to be too weak without the fianchetto bishop? Or can I allow h6? So you really have to decide if you're going to play h6 here. In this particular position, I don't think it's absolutely necessary. Let's shrink the board a little bit, and let's turn on Stockfish 14.1, and let's see if Stockfish thinks h6 is going to be necessary. He wants to play b4 first, but the question is, after b4, does he look like he wants to play h6 for black? And right now, if we're looking at the top 7 moves, h6 is not even in the top 7. So a lot of times you have to play h6 here. In this position, you don't. In fact, Stockfish, as you can see, says that if you play b4 and force the knight to retreat and then put your knight in the middle and knight e4, black's already ahead by enough to pretty much win the game. 2.6 is enough to win. All right, let's stop the analysis for the moment. We'll bring the board back to normal size. Very good. Best move, b4, knight back, and now knight e4 to hit the bishop. And he guards the bishop by playing it to f2. So now clearly black could take off the bishop and get the bishop pair and stop white from castling. Winning the bishop pair and stopping white from castling is normally a great thing to do. But here, the knight is much better than the bishop, and the bishop's really terrible. And if black doesn't take that bishop, if black, let's see what the best move is here. The best move is, I think right now the engine likes knight to b6. If he plays knight b6, he's leading by more than 3 pawns. So if you played a move like knight b6 and white now saved this bishop with a move like bishop g1, would you be all upset that you didn't win the bishop pair? No, you wouldn't. If he plays bishop h4, would you be all upset in this position that you didn't take off the bishop? Engine says, no, just play f6. And when the knight goes back, continue with pressure on the queen side with either knight a4 or c3. And this is a winning position for black. Notice if you play c3, the knight on e4 is helping it. So if you take the bishop, you can't do that. So taking the bishop is not a mistake, but it's not the best move either. All right, so bishop f2. And in the game, black did take. And black's idea was stop him from castling, win the bishop pair, and replace that knight with the other knight. The only problem is now if he puts the knight to d2, you'd have to get rid of that knight before your knight on e4 would be untouchable. All right, so white has to recapture. King takes f2. Knight f6, all according to plan. The engine says the better idea here is to play like knight takes, and whichever way he takes, he's got a problem. If he takes this way, your bishop gets on the same diagonal with the king, and you're ready to push d4 in some lines. And if he takes this way, and you play bishop e7, he can't stop f6 and then opening up the f file for the rook. Either way, the bishop pair is strong and black has the better position, the safer king and whatever. Okay, so back to the game. Knight takes f2, king takes f2, knight f6. g4, continue with his aggressive play. Does that open up lines around the king? Well, yes, but black has to figure out a way to open them up. One way to do that would be to play the knight check and then f6. All right, so he does play knight checks, and now white makes a bad move. White plays king f3, taking away the knight's only square. Now here, the first thing I'm going to look at is to play f6 here and trap the knight. And to my student's credit, he looked at f6, and he decided if I play f6, and he plays knight g6, and I play pawn takes, and he plays pawn takes, he now recognizes this from his beginning tactic books. White's threatening rook checks, king takes, queen checks, king over, queen h7 checkmate. And on the surface, it looks like that's hard to stop. For instance, if you move the rook, then can he still do that? Engine says he should just play rook h7. Don't sack the rook, just bring the queen over. And it says black's doing okay here with breaking open the center. So actually, he can do that. Rook d8. In fact, now the computer says rook d8 is actually black's best move. I think the computer also said knight g5 check is winning. Why? Well, because black's already up a piece and now he's giving it back. And if he takes it and he takes check and the king goes here, now if black just continues his development, the rook check rook checks doesn't work anymore. King takes, queen checks, and now you can't move the king because it's mate, but you play bishop here because you're up a rook. And if he takes the bishop, you trade queens, and you're up the exchange with an easily winning endgame. So cute defense there. Okay, so it turns out that allowing knight g6 on f6 is dangerous, but you can play against it, and it does trap the knight, but you really don't even have to do that. All you have to do is take the knight, and then whichever way he takes back, you break open the f-file, and white's in trouble. So even though I might have played f6, the engine actually says it's not the best move. Very interesting. So black takes, white takes that way. He doesn't want to get rid of the f-pawn so that f6 will open up the king, but f6 is still a good move here. Engine thinks bishop b7 first. Best move by black. Black's playing a great game. The engine has him up by 7 pawns. But notice, this is not like those other videos where it's when you're way ahead, it's a different game. You're up by 7 pawns, but it's not like you actually have the material on the board. It's just that if you play perfectly, you should be able to win a bunch of stuff. All right, here the engine suggests white should play king g2. White plays knight d2. Engine suggests c3, up 7.3 pawns. Black says, good, if you take, I take back check and I win your queen. White says, I better move my queen so I can take that knight. Black plays knight takes d2 check. Getting ready to play discovered attack here. Queen takes. d4 discovered attack. And now he's going to have to lose the exchange. He has to move the king. Instead, he puts the pawn in the way. All right, so if you're not sure what to do here, stop the video. Black to play. What would you play? Well, I assume most people would get this because once you see it as a puzzle, it's pretty easy. You're always looking for your checks, captures, and threats. How many checks do you have? You only have one. If you looked at bishop takes e4 check and said, that's no good, the pawn is guarded and he gets me, that's a typical quiescence error. Because bishop takes e4 check, king takes, every queen check on the diagonal is mate.
Checkmate.
So you're not risking anything. By taking that pawn, you're not going to lose the bishop for the king. Now, if you looked at it and you said, well, I lose the bishop for the pawn, and then you stop, that's a quiescence error. But if you looked further and said, what would I get if I gave up the bishop for the pawn? The answer is, well, you get a checkmate if he takes it. So therefore, e4 is actually just a big mistake. Not only are you winning the exchange, but you're getting an extra pawn for it to boot. But you have to see that move. So at this point of the game, black is told me he was starting to get a little tired. And he admitted he made a quiescence error here. And of course, he saw the bishop takes e4 check was a legal move. But he saw it was guarded and he stopped. And it wasn't until I actually gave him this is a puzzle in his lesson that I said, after bishop takes e4 check, if he plays king takes e4, what are you going to play? It took him a few seconds to realize that he has mate in 1 and that he can't take it. So even after the game, he didn't see it instantly. This is why basic tactics really decide games when both people are rated under 1800, because the people who see stuff like this just kill the people that don't see it. So you don't want to miss stuff like this. If you see bishop takes c4 check, you don't want to say I lose a bishop for a pawn. You want to say, if I give up that bishop for the pawn, do I get anything for it? And the answer is, oh yes, you get a checkmate. So that's the way to avoid quiescence errors. Does black have to do that to win? No, he could just play f6 and then thread and open up the f file, and that's winning too. Instead, he plays c3, not a terrible move, but missing the point. Pawn takes, and now he opens up the d file, takes that way, could take the other way too. Queen to e3, and now again, a move like f6 is monstrously strong. Black plays rook to d2, threatening rook takes c2. White guards the pawn. He's blocking in the rook, but the rook is in no danger. He's guarded by a pawn. And again, f6 would be the obvious move to continue to break through. Black plays f5. f5 gives white the opportunity to keep this pawn here, but it's still going to open up lines. Let's see if the engine thinks f5 is better than f6. Mr. Engine. Mr. Stockfish 14.1. Which pawn move do you like the best? And he says f6 and f5 and g5, all those moves that break open the pawns. They're all winning, but notice black's not winning as easily as he was before. He was up 7 pawns and now he's only up 1, so having missed those opportunities, like bishop takes e4 check, he gave white some time to consolidate, and you can see his advantage is down quite a tremendous amount here. But as you'll see in a second, white now plays this wrong and it goes right back up again. Let's show the top 2 moves. After f5, white takes en passant. All right, that's okay, and now rook takes f6. And now black has a threat. Black is threatening something and white needs to stop him. What he needs to do is play rook on a to f1. But he doesn't see the threat, and neither does black. So white plays rook on a to d1. Almost forcing black to play the line. And what's the line he should play? Well, again, we have these easy removal of the guard lines, where initially you win a queen and a pawn for 2 rooks, but after that you win a whole bunch more. So the move that starts it is a check again. Rook takes check. All right, well, king takes is illegal, so if he wants to win the rook, he has to take with the queen, and now you do the removal of the guard skewer, rook f2 check. If the king takes the rook, then he loses the queen, but if he doesn't, he loses the queen for nothing. So he has to take the rook, and then queen check, and now everything's falling apart here. +7 for black. For instance, if king to e2, here comes that bishop takes e4, threatening queen takes g4 check. If he attacks the queen with the rook, you can just take the pawn with check. And everything's just falling apart here. So, and you can't play the other rook over there because it's mate in 1. So this is completely winning. So again, if you look at rook takes pawn check and you say, okay, well, I can't do that because he's got it guarded twice, and if I take with the rook and he takes with the queen, I just lose my rook for a pawn. The answer is, well, yes, but if you look one move further with rook f2 check, you're winning the queen. So you're going to end up getting a queen and a pawn for the 2 rooks, but then you're opening up the king and you're winning more pawns at the end of that. So that's a completely winning combination. If you miss stuff like this, it's quiescence errors, and you want to put these in your study book. You can create a personalized study book that's just like a basic tactics book for things that you miss. Because I asked my student after the game, what rating do you think would get this right in a slow game at least half the time? And I forget what he guessed, but my guess was 1,700 or so. 16 or 1,700. I would say anybody under 1,600 would miss it over half the time. And people over 1,800 are going to get this a very high percentage of the time, and over 2,000 almost all the time in slow games. Now, speed games, well, in speed games, people miss things all the time. But in slow games where you have lots of time on your clock, this really isn't super hard. Okay, so let's keep going. We'll turn off the engine. So again, black misses this idea, and he would be up 7 pawns if he plays rook takes check. Rook over there. Rook takes d1. Rook takes g5. Trying to get that same idea. Pawn takes en passant, pawn takes, and white plays g5, which actually is not a great move because black doesn't want his rook on the 6th rank anyway. He wants it on the 7th rank, where he can come over to the h file and come down. So he plays rook f7, and white tries to get out of the way with king to g4. Black breaks up the pawns with e5, and now if white tries to play f5, let's let the computer show you. On f5, engine says, you could do that. Says maybe pin it some more with bishop c8. No, now he's thinking maybe not. So now he says, now he thinks that white's okay here. He's saying f5 is actually a good move. All right, what's the second best move? If f5 is okay for white, does he have a second best move? And the answer is yes, he could just play rook f1 with about equality. All right, but what does white do? White takes the pawn and opens up his king. Whoa! So now black's got all kinds of moves. He's got queen takes c5, he's got rook h8, he's got bishop c8. So f takes e5 was, according to this, a 14-pawn mistake. White has opened up his own king, and now black's back to winning easily again. All three of his pieces can attack the king. He starts with the bishop. The king goes over there to avoid the queen takes e5 check, but now the rook can come in with check. So the rook checks, and now the only legal move is king 8 g3, losing the queen to rook h3 check, so white can resign. White says, I'll make you play it, and he plays here. Well, now we have a little bit of that story of the game again. By this point, black's been playing a bunch of good moves earlier, but he got really tired, but he has lots of time on the clock. Or I wouldn't say lots of time, but a reasonable amount. What he should do is, splash some water on his face, go get some coffee, some tea. Well, coffee is caffeine, so that's maybe not the best thing to get, but get something to eat, slap himself around a little bit, do something to wake himself up. But instead, he's running on adrenaline here, but his adrenaline, he's tired. And he said when he saw rook checks, he figured that just king takes rook. He can't do that. He missed with his board vision the fact that the bishop was guarding it, which is something below his level, but he was very tired at this point. And instead of refreshing himself, taking a couple minute break, he just kept going, and that was probably his biggest mistake of the game, was to not freshen up here for a minute, because at this point the game is over. Rook h3 check, bye-bye, mate in 12, says Stockfish. He plays queen takes e5 check. That's plenty good to win also. Minus 16, but the game would have been over if he checked with the rook. And now the king goes back, and now you actually have to start calculating. Is it better to bring the rook up, or is it better to bring the queen up? The engine says it's much better to bring the queen up. If you bring the queen up, it holds more squares. And if he goes something like king to e1, you can check on h1, and he can't run away. And if he tries to bring the king up, then rook checks is going to win. And if he brings the bishop over here, you can attack the bishop with the rook. And now if he brings the rook down check, you can just bring your king out of the way, king here. And the queen can't go to h3 check because the bishop's on it. And if the rook takes, it's going to be mate in 1.
Checkmate.
So black should bring the queen down. The queen down is better, but he's running on fumes here, and he plays rook checks, which still wins, but not as easily. You can see the number for the evaluation drops to -4, so he's got to be a little careful. Let's turn off the engine here. We'll bring the board back to regular size. King to e1. All right, what's the best move here? He plays it, rook checks. And now white's pretty much got to bring the bishop in the way. If he brings the king up, we're going to get queen checks, and the game's going to be over. So he puts the bishop in the way. Now black needs to be careful. So again, we could use this as a puzzle. You could stop the video. Don't turn on your engine. What's black's best move here? Black to play. Well, it's getting a little bit tricky. Turns out the best move is to play pure defense here for one move, and that is to stop this rook checks. And the best move is queen to c7, which keeps an eye on everything and threatens to play bishop h3, but doesn't let white's pieces in on the black king. The second best move is bishop to f5, the sneaky pin, where he can't take you because you take the queen. And now if he tries to check with the rook, you can run your king up. It says you have to go to this square. You can't go to h7 because of this queen check. So what you have to do is go to f7, and now if he gives you the queen check, you can put the queen in the way. And now if he takes your queen and you take back, you're hitting the rook and he doesn't have time to take the bishop. So for instance, queen takes, king takes, and now if he goes back and guards the pawn, now you can move the bishop to h3 and game over. Alright, so back to the game. So queen here is number 1, bishop here is number 2. Black really doesn't even pay attention to what Black's now playing complete hope chess. And he plays a hopeless move. He plays bishop h3, letting the pieces in. Now, if Black plays perfectly, he should be able to at least get a draw. But he's got to be very careful. So rook checks. And now we've got to be able to put the queen in the way when the queen checks. Should we play king f7 and then queen e7? Or should we play king h7 and queen g7? Well, it turns out king f7 doesn't work because queen f3 check picks up the rook. So you have to guard against this check and this check, which means the only defensive move is king to h7. And now again, queen h3 doesn't work because the rook takes h3. Bishop h3 is impossible. Rook to d7 can be met by bishop takes. And queen checks is met by queen to g7. And he can't put the rook here to skewer, to pin him because the bishop's guarding it and Black's winning. So therefore, after king h7, White can't play queen checks. White has to just guard the bishop with rook f1. And now if both sides play perfectly, Black's a little bit better. I think right now we're looking at king to g7 with an advantage to Black. But this requires perfect play, and both sides have been making big mistakes. Now when these games get really critical, that's when good players really take their time and find the right moves. And here both players are really showing their colors a little bit when it got critical because both players were making some bad moves. So in the game, Black, again, he's tired, he's not looking. He plays king there. Now we saw queen a7 doesn't work because of queen e7. So instead, White plays the correct queen f3 check, hitting the rook and the king, and now it's bye-bye game. Black was the one up by 7, 14, whatever points we got up to a couple moves ago. I guess when it was queen h2, it was, let's see here, this was minus 10.5 about, minus 11 now. So he was up that far or more when he could have won the queen. And now with king f7, it's exactly gone the other way. He's 20 pawns worse than he was before. He was up by 11, now he's down by like 9. Puts the bishop in the way. White says, all right, you can have the pawn, I'll take the rook. Black says, do I get a discovered attack? And White says, no, I'm just going to checkmate you. Black puts the queen in the way. If he moved the king up, then rook checks would win the queen anyway. Of course, White might miss it like Black missed rook h3 or earlier. Queen in the way, and now we have that the skewer, rook d7 check, winning the queen for nothing. And it's mate in 5, and if it wasn't mate, he'd be down about 30 pawns. And Black understandably resigns. So the big one got away. Black had this wonderful attack. He got tired. His biggest mistake of the game, as we said a few moves ago, was actually continuing to play when he was a little punch drunk here. If he would have just slapped himself around a few times, and I'm saying using that figuratively, not literally, put some water on his face, got something to drink, maybe got a little bit to eat, took 2 or 3 minutes. He has a 45-second increment and looked at the board with fresh eyes. Rook checks here, minus 14, minus 13. And even after the way he played it, he played queen e5 check. He could have played rook h3 check on this move. Instead, queen takes here. And even here, if he plays it right, minus 13, 14 already in this position. Okay, so you got to be careful about being a little bit sloppy when you get to these super critical positions, because the difference between the best moves and the second best moves in super critical conditions are often the difference between winning easily or barely winning or not winning at all, or maybe between winning and losing. It really makes a big difference when you see these things. But these are the kind of games which, a lot of my students play, and you want to learn from these games and try to not make the same mistakes that they did. And Hopefully that makes you a better player. Okay, you can like the video, you can subscribe, but the best thing you can do is tell people about the channel, Dan Heisman Chess. Thanks a lot for watching. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.